Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee. We're in a slightly different meeting room this evening, slightly smaller. So if anybody's watching on the live stream, do bear with us. We may have to have people swapping places a little bit in order to make sure that everyone who needs to speak can speak. This meeting is obviously live streamed and will be available on the council website. In the room this evening, you have members of the committee on either side of the table. We've also got our monitoring officer, democracy officer, and other officers who will be contributing during the meeting at the end of the table. We have had apologies this evening from Councillor Webb, and I'm delighted to say Councillor Perrott has been able to substitute Councillor Webb. Haven't had any other apologies. Going to start by asking for any declarations of interest from any members. Nope, marvellous. So move on to the minutes of the last meeting, which was held on the 30th of November. And there is a typo on our agendas. It says 2023, but it was 2022. It's used, that's the other way around to the usual year typos that we get at this time of year. But the meeting was held on the 30th of November 2022, and it is correct on the minutes. It's only on the agenda item where that little typo has been made. So the minutes are correct. Is there any corrections that anyone wants to raise with those minutes? No, in that case, everyone happy for me to sign them? Great, I shall do so. Anything that anyone wants to raise from the minutes that isn't on the agenda? Nope. Okay, we'll move swiftly into public participation. We have one member of the public registered to speak this evening who is here in person, which is great because it's great to be able to see who's speaking. So Mr. Mendes, do you want to come over? And I know you know this better than probably many of us do, because you've probably attended more audit and governance committee meetings than some of us. So I shall just remind you that you have 3 minutes to speak, and off you go.
Hi. Yeah, I know I said goodbye last year, but hey. One more time, I'd like to raise a few points with you today. First of all, on audit, which is my favourite subject, as Max knows, I'd love to see what areas are not deemed to be areas at risk in the 2023-24 audit plan document. I struggle to think of much. Maybe you should ask Max to identify them for you, or is the plan simply to keep all options open for GRAG to decide what audits you actually undertake? And also on audit, I obviously don't know if ANG members still get to see the internal audit reports. I hope you do, even if your ability to follow through on bad reports is severely limited. However, I thought the idea was that they would be published on open data, and the numbers tell a story over the last 5 years. Starting from 2018, there were 41, 34, 5 in 2020, which I guess is a COVID thing, 17 in 2021, and 6 in 2022. What's going on is my simple question on that. And on audit stuff, I wrote to Katie and Johnny Crawshaw back end of last year, asking the question whether poor internal audits, which are seen but not acted on in audit and governance, should actually be passed on to a scrutiny committee so that at least a councillor and an executive member sees the bad reports, that they're not simply left to be managed by the people who are participating potentially in the badness. But as a committee, notwithstanding that, you are now seemingly in a situation when you have no control over the audit programme and no visibility of the outcomes. So in some senses, that might be, in some people might see that as job done. I couldn't possibly share that view. So on Treasury, I note the report this year says it was felt there was a significant risk of a much sharper rise in long and short-term rates, and it goes on a bit. The likely action that fixed rate funding will be drawn down whilst interest rates are lower than they're projected to be in the next few years. Now, Debbie will know we've had for many years a conversation about forward borrowing, which I thought was against the rules. Otherwise, surely in 2019, 2020, with the PWLB rate at virtually zero, there were golden opportunities to borrow forward for things like York Central. Anyway, it would be interested to know whether that's still in place and whether you found a way through it. And just as an aside, no doubt this will come up anyway, but the sentence PWLB forecasts shown below have taken into account the 20 basis point certainty rate reduction effected as of the 1st of November 2012 means absolutely nothing to me. I'd be interested to know what it means to anybody else. And finally, within my 3 minutes, I hope, on audit and governance membership, I believe you changed the constitution to include 2 independents on audit and governance. It seems to me to make sense to stagger these appointments so that you have a bit of continuity between the independents, though I don't think this was the plan. When will you seek a second member? And that's me done. Thank you.
Thank you. Just slightly over, but we'll allow that. Thank you. I'm certain that many of those topics will be picked up on during the course of this evening by members of the committee. But just to respond to the issue you raised with myself and Councillor Crawshaw, we have indeed talked about whether we bring officers to audit and governance to deal with issues that are raised in audit, or whether we send it to scrutiny, or whether we bring it to here and then send to scrutiny. And we're having a conversation about how that might best work. Okay. We don't have any other public participants, so we'll move on to item 4, which is the consultation on the annual audit work programme. So, Max, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. So, as the committee will be aware, we prepare an internal audit work programme each year. The work programme is risk-based and it's also flexible. We also have to make sure that whatever work that we undertake provides sufficient coverage of the council's arrangements. And what we do is we actually define 11 key areas that we need to provide or obtain assurance on to be able to provide the annual opinion. And those 11 key areas are set out in paragraph 11 of the report. So looking ahead for 2023-24, we are starting the process of preparing the work programme. As in the last couple of years, it's going to be a list of what we regard as the sort of key risk areas, the sort of priority areas to look at. We will be talking to senior managers. We'll be looking at the council's risk registers. We'll be looking at emerging issues and themes, both in the council but elsewhere. We'll obviously be talking to our colleagues in external audit, but we also welcome the views of this committee to help sort of shape the areas that we're going to look at. So this report is really the starting point of that process. So we are very keen to hear what your views are, which areas might you regard as a priority, which areas, I mean, we've included a long list of areas that we could consider to include in the programme, but equally other areas that you think we've perhaps missed. So it's very much open to the committee to sort of feedback their thoughts and ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. Any thoughts, comments from the committee? Joe.
Hi, it's something really is a follow-up for the public question at the beginning, which is what exactly is the function of an audit committee, and is the stuff that's coming to it the right stuff and is being received in the right way? I'm used to audit programs being part of multi-year programs. If things move between one year and another year, there's a kind of explanation of why it's dropped its priority, why it's had an increase in priority. So you'd see a multi-year program. If you're given data in isolation, this is what we think we should do this year, and we may have changed some of the things. As a committee, you're not in a position to note how things have changed and moved. Now, I'm back to my other thing, which is I don't necessarily understand how local authorities do things now, but it's not always a bit like other areas where I've worked do things. So the idea you would have an audit and scrutiny committee doing some things, sorry, an audit committee doing some things and a scrutiny committee doing some things screams out as a problem, which is you've got two guys doing two things. They either both try and do it or neither of them try and do it. And in a perfect world, they're perfectly aligned, but it doesn't necessarily work too well with audit issues where you may be saying it's the other guy's issue to do. So that's not about the audit function, it's about the governance of audit activity, about you take your own view about whether you need a multi-year program. You've made a decision, you made a decision 2 years ago, you run it in a particular way, and that's how it's being run. But I'm used to the reciprocal question, which is if something's dropped down, why? What isn't being considered as important as it was being considered the last time the exercise was carried out? And then there's the minimum standard, which is something may not be a high priority, and it hasn't been a high priority for the last 4 years. But at which point does absence of consideration lead to a long-term problem? Because it's never high priority, it's only ever medium priority, but everything should be looked at sometimes. So that again twists it back around to looking at things in a multi-year context, and also looking at the when was it last looked at question about an area of exploration. So some of that's, you know, I'm not criticizing the actual program. I'm simply saying you as a committee, if it's me included in that context, we as a committee, what is the role? And therefore, the earlier comment from the chair, what is the role in relation to a scrutiny committee? And I see some areas of danger in that. Audit reports, officers responsible for audit report should sometimes be appearing in front of a committee. It should be obvious who that committee is. And if there is a development that moves on from it, which is the committee which can really follow that through? Is it a scrutiny committee or is it an audit committee? I'd have thought it was more probably an audit committee, but that's because I don't fully understand what a scrutiny committee does, other than I thought it was a sharp in and out kind of role in relation to activity that's going on. I've gone on quite a bit. It's all around the technical issues about how the process is managed. It's not about any individual thing you decide to look at this year or things you decide to look at last year, but it's about being able to follow the chain and make sure that you've got field coverage of everything. And as Max points out, there are some key areas, and those key areas have definitely got it covered off. But I would caution there's some areas which may not seem terribly key, but if you haven't looked at them for 10 years, it might be very embarrassing for everybody that they've just been considered of medium priority. And in audit terms, they may be, but in governance terms, they may not be. I've gone on long enough. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Max to come in and respond to any of that you wish to in a moment, and Bryn might have some thoughts as well. But I mean, what I would say is that we have in the past referred things to a scrutiny committee where we receive information in our role as audit and governance, looking at audit and looking at governance issues, which we think actually needs a more operational decision based approach to it. So if we uncover something and we think as an authority we really need to be looking at how we do that better, that's not for this committee to do. We don't have the right people here to look at, okay, that means we need to think about how we approach this area of work in a different way. The feedback from the audits, the incredibly detailed feedback from audits, will inevitably help that. And it's our job to work with relevant scrutiny committees to say, right, you need to do a piece of scrutiny work around this, because it needs a little bit more than just saying, remember to follow your own policies. But Max, is there anything you want to come back on there?
Yeah, well, just a few things. Obviously, our programme of work, it is informed by our recent audit experience. So chances are, if we've looked at an area and we've identified a whole load of issues, we will follow it up, but we'll almost certainly also regard it as remaining as high risk. So we'll look at it again. the audit resources is limited. We just do not have the capacity to look at every area, so we do have to make some judgments. But we do work very closely with management to understand where there are issues and concerns, and that does help inform the work programme. I recognise the risk, though, that you may have an area that appears might be a small budget delivering a fairly specific function or service, and it just doesn't appear on anyone's radar, and that's always a risk. But I think these days we have moved away from what traditionally would have been a cyclical audit plan, where because we haven't looked at something, within the last 5 years, it needs to be audited. We probably, we don't have the resources to be able to do that, and it's not the way that we work. But clearly, we are dependent on using as much intelligence as we can, talking to managers and understanding where there are issues. And if there are issues that come up, if there's an issue that comes up during the year, we will because the plan is flexible, we can then look at it.
Could I just add on one thing, which is the audit committee and the senior management of the organisation will do something. Sorry, the internal audit function and the senior management of the organisation will do something. What is the function of the audit committee?
I was just about to come on to that. So what we're being asked to do in this item is, this is our chance to say what areas we think should be a focus for the work of internal audit. So on page 10 and 11 of your report, I think those are the most important pages, really, because there you'll find the list of potential areas of work, and this is our opportunity to say, are there items in this list that we think should be given priority? Are there things that we have questions about, concerns about? So I'd invite members to focus on that, really, and think about whether there are any things on that list that we think should be a particular focus. One of the things, I'll start us off. One of the things I thought in the strategic and corporate box was the governance framework, schemes of delegation, constitution and transparency. And I highlight that because obviously we've done rather a big piece of work recently in response to the public interest report around governance, and schemes of delegation have been amended, the constitution updated, and obviously there's still more work ongoing, but I think that does need to be a priority for us as an authority, to make sure that we genuinely are embedding that good governance, and we talk about it regularly in this committee, but I think it would be helpful to have some more data to inform those discussions. I'll open it up, see if there's any other views from anyone else. Councillor Cuthbertson, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. A number of points that have been put forward in the last few minutes, I think are worth paying attention to. The question of items that are so small that we don't need to worry about them this year, a situation that continues from year and year until we end up in a situation where schools which achieve an excellent or an outstanding result in an Ofsted inspection after more than 10 years are suddenly found to be not so good when they didn't need to be inspected simply because they were so excellent. And I realise this is the reverse of that, but I do think that it's a very valid point, and it's something we should take account of. In terms of the relationship between this committee and scrutiny committees generally, seems to me that scrutiny committees are organised very much on a service area basis. So unless the question relates to the operation or maybe the internal governance of that service area, but I think that might still come back to this committee. In general, if it's in general a question of governance or of financial probity, those matters should be dealt with by this committee and not referred to scrutiny. I do think that scrutiny is in a situation where it's got its work cut out to meet the workload that's being asked of it. On the point you've just raised, with regard to the Council's corporate governance framework, schemes of delegation and constitution has just slipped in there as a second point. If we're going to have a once-off review of it, so that Bryn, as our governance director, is comfortable with the situation which is inherited, I think it might be worthwhile doing that review before we start looking into the wider implications of that, as you've just been outlining. In other words, that it's actually dealt with before, if you like, the adherence to that framework is examined more widely. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else got any thoughts on that? Councillor Fisher.
Thank you. I'd just like to, there are two areas that I always have worries about with councils in terms of audit procedures. One is procurement and contract management, and the other one is IC strategy and security. Now, can I just ask, I didn't have time to look through all the past audit group things I've got, stored on my computer. When were those last, please, Max? Do you know?
Not off the top of my head.
No. I believe I have seen a report for procurement, but I think it's such a critical area. I always like to keep that, regularly upgraded, say every 3 years, to just check that there aren't holes in our procedures. Because we've seen on the fraud report, that's a critical area where fraud can be carried out.
Any other views from members? Councillor Cuthbertson.
I'm sorry to ask a couple of further questions. First of all, under service areas on page 11, the last but one bullet point deals with contract management stroke client arrangements, e.g. Explore stroke YMT. Can I ask if that covers City of York trading, and I should declare an interest there as chair of the board of that company?
Those are just examples that it could. We could decide that City of York trading or Make It York are the areas that we look at, or we don't look at any of them.
Sorry, I missed that last point. Did you say it could apply to them, or it does?
No, in terms of the programme we come up with, if we decide that contract management of and client arrangements of the client organisations the council has an interest in or actually owns, then if that's included in the programme, then clearly Make It York and City of York trading might be within the scope.
Okay, thank you. One other point on the first bullet point of service areas, I noticed that we have adult and children's social care, which are actually two very different service areas, and I suspect that we ought to separate them out from that point of view. There is another mention of service areas such as schools, which is not inconsiderable. Even though the audit process for a particular school might be a smaller matter generally, in fact, the operation and the governance arrangements relating to the school and its implications for the governance service, I think, may need to be examined as a separate service area in their own right. Just thoughts, Chair. Thank you. Max, go ahead.
Yeah. Just to confirm, I think we've just blocked those all together, but when we actually present the programme, they will be split out. So you'll see that, and clearly we will treat adults and children's social services separately. We wouldn't block them together.
I was avoiding getting into too much of the detail, because in a sense I don't feel there's sufficient information to make choices. But given some of the things that have been mentioned, I think there are two politically potentially sensitive. I mean politically with a small p, not politically with a big P, which are Ukrainians being housed in the area and generally immigration, being housed in the area, is to how well they are being looked after, how the fundings are going. Some of those things have potential of working with other agencies, but also having quite a lot of sensitivity around them. Now, they're not major strategic audit issues, but who keeps an eye on some of the overarching things that affect the council from groups like that coming in, current high press profile for those kind of things.
Did you want to come in there, Bryn?
Just on that point, I think my observation would be that's probably closer to a scrutiny committee function, because it's looking at the detail of how things are dealt with rather than the sort of overview that this committee has. But yeah, it's something that's certainly worth looking at.
Any other areas that any members think audit should be focusing on? There's one more that I wanted to mention, and that's housing repairs. Because obviously there's a great deal of work going on in that area at the moment in response to recent very tragic events, and I think it would be useful to bring that up the priority list for audit to make sure that our authority is doing everything it should do around housing repairs.
If I can just say, I think we'd already identified that as almost certainly to be on the list.
Is there anything else that anyone wanted to ask or mention? Oh, sorry.
Sorry, can I just clarify, because obviously people brought up some, but can I just clarify which ones were actually suggesting to Max that were?
Well, I think the request from internal audit was for us to tell them all our thoughts as part of the consultation process.
Right.
I don't think we're formally making any requests or anything so formal as that. It is simply a consultation with this committee to get our thoughts as the people who receive the audits of what are things that we believe need to be high priority. Have I got that right, Max?
That's right, and we have made notes of. So.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you. Is everybody content then to have had their chance to make any comments they want to on the audit plan? Right. Then we'll move on to item 5, which is the counter fraud framework update. And back to you, Max.
Chair. So again, each year we undertake a review of the Council's counter fraud policy framework, and we also do a couple of other things. We update the strategy action plan, and we produce a fraud risk assessment. And the fraud risk assessment, that's the tool that helps inform our work programme for the coming year. And it also helps the Council to understand where further fraud prevention and detection measures may be required. So the report itself, we provide some background both nationally and locally. We have looked at the current policy framework, and we're not suggesting any changes at this time. However, we have updated the fraud strategy action plan. So we've identified the areas that we think have been completed from last year's, but we've also identified some actions for the coming year. So we've identified those. And we've also refreshed the fraud risk assessment, again, helping to identify where we think there are the main risk areas in terms of fraud for the Council. So that's presented to the committee for information.
Thanks, Max. Any questions, comments from members? Councillor Fisher.
Thank you, Chair. Page 21, paragraph 8, it mentions that many referrals are not economic to investigate criminally as the loss to the council is very low. There is also the thought that if the people get away with it, they'll just do it again and again. So are there any sort of procedures in place to deal with ones that aren't actually, actually criminally taken forward just to make sure there's deterrence. I noticed also on page 22, paragraph 12, we have this right to issue cautions with conditions. And those that now are looking as if they're going to be withdrawn. Have alternative sanctions been put in place to deal with these low-level issues?
Yeah, so every suspected fraud case that comes in, we do sift them. Often the amounts are quite small, and it wouldn't be economic for ourselves to investigate, and certainly not to prosecute. But we will always work with the relevant service to try and recover that loss, but also to avoid to end it, so we don't incur any further losses. But then there's a sort of scale then, which if it is a larger fraud, but it's still not sufficient to incur the cost of prosecution, because that's quite a significant commitment, we will certainly aim to recover the loss. As the paper sets out, up till now, we've had some tools that we can use, one of which is to issue cautions or warning letters. And we may or may not be able to continue to do that. But if it's a more serious case, we will look to prosecute. And we do take cases forward. And one of the reasons we do that is obviously we want to recover the loss, but also deal with the perpetrator. But it's also to send a clear message to everyone else who might be contemplating fraud that the council takes it seriously and will take action.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments anyone has? No? We shall take that as noted. Thank you very much. And we shall move on to agenda item 6, which is Treasury management strategy and prudential indicators.
Thank you, Chair. So as a reminder, this is a statutory report that is required by the Prudential Code. The report is here for you to consider in your review and scrutiny role, and will be presented to Executive on the 9th of February, and then ultimately full Council as part of the suite of budget reports at a Budget Council. So the strategy leaves investment criteria and credit limits largely unchanged, given we already operate on those core principles of security, liquidity, yield. The report does include an update on the impact of the new Treasury Management Code and the Prudential Code that will come into effect in the next financial year. And whilst I appreciate there's a lot of information in here, a significant amount of detail, there is nothing particular that I want to draw your attention to. As the 151 officer, I've got no areas of concern. We're not doing anything particularly unusual, particularly different. We're not doing any new investments. We're not taking out borrowing in any weird and wonderful ways. It's very much sort of steady state. Shall I just pick up some of the comments from the public speaker as well? So in terms of the text that was mentioned is included generally every year, and I guess there's a distinction between that borrowing in advance of need and borrowing for investment purposes. And what this report here is referring to is essentially saying that as we have identified a need to borrow in future, as evidenced by the capital finance requirement, then should it be appropriate, we can look at borrowing at today's rates. So we haven't needed to borrow yet, actually, in 22-23, and we don't expect that we will need to before the end of the financial year. And so whilst obviously we're experiencing high interest rates at the moment, you'll see from the forecast that's included in the report that they're expected to peak during this calendar year before dropping again to the more usual rate. And so we haven't taken out any fixed rate forward borrowing because A, we haven't needed to, but also, I mean, the highest PWLB forecast for a 10-year loan at the moment is 4.4%, which is still cheaper than borrowing we took out in 2001. So it is more of an art than a science, but so that's what that refers to. And then I think Mr. Mendes also referred to the certainty rate, which all that refers to is that the standard rate from the PWLB is reduced by 20 basis points on loans to principal local authorities who provide information as required on their plans for long-term borrowing and associated capital spending. So basically, because we do a return to government every year setting out our plans, we get a 0.2% discount on the PWLB rate. So that's all that refers to.
Thank you, Debbie, for untangling some of the mysteries of Treasury management for us. Any questions from anybody? Any comments? Go ahead.
I'll begin with the absolutely positive statement, which is it's 43 to 78, the page numbers. It's complex, it's technical, it's developed with advice and internal challenge. You know, if people around here think they can dig into that, they are doing very well. But what I would say is the context of what the audit function is. Debbie described it as being to review and scrutinize, but the actual recommendation is to note, and I'm a fierce opponent of using the word note in relation to what organizations are doing, in the sense that it's one up from you know, to receive or something. It has no suggestion of doing something, although Debbie's description did, you know, receive it and scrutinize it, because when you go into paragraph 16, 17 and 18, that's very clear that there is a function for the committee. So you ask yourselves, they're required to be scrutinized. The scrutiny role is undertaken by audit and governance. The code says that members with responsibility for Treasury management receive adequate training in Treasury management, and this especially applies to members responsible for scrutiny. So the training needs of Treasury management officers is also periodically reviewed. So two things: audit committee should know a bit about what it's about, and it talks about training, and that's the member's responsibility, not somebody writing a report in a sense about process. But secondly, it does say required to scrutinize before being recommended. So you have to then say it's a report received in this way, in this format, a way for you to scrutinize. And if you're happy, that's great, because you've done the training and you know what it's all about, and you will therefore meet the SIPFA requirements. Commentary, no more than that, really.
Thank you, Joe. And obviously we do provide sessions for audit and governance members on Treasury management every year, to help us to not be completely terrified or bamboozled when we receive these reports. And just on the bit about the report being to note, it is to note. We can also opt to send you know, any commentary we like when this goes in front of executive and when it goes to full council for ultimate sign off. But our role is earlier on in the process. Debbie.
Yeah, I just so we can, yeah, I take the point entirely, and we can update the recommendation. And what would normally happen if, I mean, it's a pretty steady state year, it's nothing very exciting here. If there had been something a bit more exciting and interesting, what I've done in the past where we've perhaps changed our MRP policy or done something a bit unusual, is I've then taken back, for the exec report, I would have included a commentary from this committee if there were any comments or concerns that needed to be raised. So we would do it that way. But yeah, absolutely take your point. I can update the recommendation in future.
Councillor Fisher.
Thank you, Chair. I read this report with considerable interest. It was difficult. I admire somebody who can put it together and understand it thoroughly and actually get to grips with all these issues. It did reassure me that we're not going to fall into the appalling mess that some other councils have got themselves in, particularly through third-party borrowing, where I believe one council lent 90 million quid to a loans company which became insolvent, and that's gone. You know, and that could cause horrors, and I'm quite satisfied that we are not doing that. Just a couple of little issues. Page 54, the current portfolio position. On 46, it says the current council's treasury portfolio position at 31st December 2021. At the bottom on table 4 is its current position at 2022. Which is it? Sorry, it's obviously a typo, one of them, but
it is. It's yeah, it should be. It's as at the 31st December 2022.
So it is the up-to-date position on that working year. Thank you for that. Just wanted to check that. The other slight issue with it is on page 52, that lovely diagram where it says it's a bit like, I don't know if you remember, there was a snooker thing on television, tournament television, and the commentator said he's going for the red by the middle pocket, which for those watching in black and white is the one next to the blue. We've got the red dotted line and that, but unfortunately printed in black and white, it's a bit tricky. And it doesn't help me going onto the council computer system and looking directly, because unfortunately I'm colourblind, so I can't tell which is red and which is green anyway. So I just wonder if we could perhaps try and use
anywhere to go then, haven't you, really?
I had nowhere to go. So I have to confess, I don't quite know what that table is meaning. But is there any way we could try and do it a different way for those of us who have got colour vision defects?
There is a way to have the labels with a little line to the line that they
It could be better if that was done. Yeah, I don't know if that's just something.
Yeah, it's a new graph, and actually I had exactly the same question when I sat with Tony, who wrote most of the report, and we went through it in a bit more detail, because I had exactly the same. What line am I looking at here? What is this telling me? So basically, it's telling you that everything kind of matches, and it's a graph that shows that the gap is what you would expect it to be. The gap is consistent between what we are currently borrowing and what we need to borrow. Good. So if what we were borrowing was going up and what we need to borrow was going down, that would give you cause for concern, or vice versa. But what it's saying is we're toddling along at a fairly steady state, really, is what that's saying to you. That, you know, and obviously it goes down because we're over a certain period of time. We don't know what's going to happen in 5-10 years time. But yes, we will. Like I say, it's a new graph. It's a new indicator. So it's the first time we've included it. So I'm sure there's lots of room for improvement. So we will go in and have a look at that one.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions, comments relating to this one from anyone? No. Excellent. So we are noting that for it to carry on its path through executive to full council. Takes us on to agenda item number 7, the report of the monitoring officer. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Members have the report in front of them. I think I'm not going to try and steal any of the thunder that Claire is going to bring to the meeting, other than to express my personal thanks to Claire for the work that's gone into the training programme. I think it's an excellent job, and doubtless members can pass their own judgment on that. I've also mentioned in the report there are a couple of issues ongoing. So with regards to the Constitution, and particularly the need to constantly monitor the Constitution and to perform updates every 6 months, we are currently in the process of a fairly light touch set of updates, which will deal with the typographical errors, the bits and pieces where legislation has changed, and we just have to make the change. The intention is that a much more comprehensive review will be undertaken once the elections are out of the way. I've already identified that there are a number of changes that I consider the Constitution needs. It is a living document. It's never finished. So, and whilst we may slim it down a little from its current 700 and something pages, it's a document that needs to cover either all eventualities or give us a methodology for dealing with those. There will be a method that we follow, so I will come up with some changes, officers will come up with some changes, but members will be invited to give us suggestions for things that they think need changing. We'll put those into a machine, and we'll come up with a proposed revised version, which we will then take through a working group so that members get to feed into that, and it will then come to this committee for their thoughts before it then has to go on to full council. I'm delighted to note that there's been no significant issues from a governance perspective since the last report was brought, and I think that's always a positive. So anything that comes up, I'm always happy to report. If the committee will indulge me, I will pick up on a couple of issues that I'm conscious of. First off, members will be aware that the Local Government Association is working on its public interest report. The intention as things stand is that we are going to try and organise a special committee for, I believe, the 7th of February is the date that everybody seems to be available. So that will then receive the final version of that PIR report from the Local Government Association. So I know that you've confirmed you're available, Chair, and we know that the officers from the LGA are as well. The second issue I thought it was worth mentioning is the issue of an action log. So with members' indulgence, I will hand round what is currently a draft version. Realistically, this hasn't been circulated with the papers because at this stage, this is what we think it should look like. What are your thoughts? And I'd rather do that than simply publish something and then you tell me that you don't like it. Plenty of copies to make sure that you have them. I shall come around the book.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to take any thoughts. Any thoughts on this?
This is just about the design of the tracker, not the individual actions. We'll be looking at those once we adopt the tracker. But this is about, is this the right information to be on an action tracker? Is there anything else we need? And if we are all content with it, then this will form part of the agenda for future meetings. Joe.
Suck it and see. I mean, I think it's a start. You'll find out if it's practical when you try and use it. Somebody will say you should have an extra column. Somebody will say you can merge two columns, but until you actually try and use it, it's hard to tell. Those are obviously the very basic things that are very helpful in having a tracker, but see how you can live with it, I would suggest.
Thank you, Joe. My watchword was simplicity, because nobody wants to further complicate things. We're also, Bryn and I have talked about, essentially this is a spreadsheet. We shall have a second tab on the spreadsheet for closed actions. So once something has been closed, it remains on the main tab until it's been to the meeting. After the meeting, it gets transferred to the second tab. And that will mean that you will only ever see on here open or very recently closed items to keep it tidy. But we will also have that second tab will exist and it still will be there. And so if in 2 years' time somebody says, what meeting was it where we agreed to do X, then you would be able to use the tracker quite simply to determine that. But I didn't want hundreds of closed actions to scroll through before you get to the one you want to look at, because obviously anything that's open or just closed is what we particularly want to see. But if there are any other comments on it, happy to take them, or feedback separately. Go on, Councillor Fisher.
I was just going to say that is so critical, because I noticed when I got my joint standards pack, the little section of cases had suddenly been whittled down to about 3 pages, whereas I think the last one had 30-odd pages on it, and most of those were closed cases. It really is important that once a case is closed and dealt with, get it into the archive.
Thank you, Councillor Fisher, and I'm really grateful to Bryn and Robert for desperately seeking a date for an additional meeting for us to receive that report from the LGA. This is the peer review final report number 3, and I thought it was particularly important for us to get that report, for Mark to be able to come and present it, but for us to be able to then make any recommendations we want to make to full council. And obviously to do that, we've got deadlines to meet, because we need to get that to the March full council, because that is the last one of the current council. So we thought that was really important, and I just wanted to publicly explain our decision making there for slotting in an additional meeting to do that, because it is really important.
Thank you, Chair. I think beyond that, I don't think I've got anything else to add. I would say we could, of course, colour code the chart, but I'm conscious that would perhaps might disadvantage translation, so we'll just leave it as it is.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions for Bryn on his report? Joe?
It's something for you as a group of councillors, really, and for your successors. People often talk very negatively about what councillors do and don't do, but it would be interesting to get a lot of them to try and go through an induction programme like this. It's actually a difficult role to be.
I think you're on the next item.
Oh,
sorry, Joe, we've not moved on to that.
Claire is coming in with a much better report.
Right. Well, I was trying to say some positive things about it.
Hold the thought.
I was taking it as a follow-up to your comment.
Yeah. Okay. If there's nothing else for Bryn, If you do have any more thoughts about the tracker before next meeting, please feed them back to Bryn so that we can put that in place and get it going. If not, we shall note Bryn's report and move on to the fabulous member induction plan. And Claire, I'll hand over to you to take all the glory in presenting it.
Thank you very much, Councillor. It is very much a team effort, I have to say. So I've worked with officers, with the LGA and with external providers to pull this together for you. As you know, you invited it for consideration last time you met. So here it is today, Annex A. It provides a comprehensive induction development programme taking place over the first 6 months of councillors, newly elected and returning councillors coming back from May to December next year, and covers a huge range of subjects. Those subjects have been identified through both the LGA and with officers who have worked closely with councillors and sort of recognising various areas that provide more detail and need to go into a bit more depth. It shows you in the Annex A the sessions that are compulsory and can be viewed at councillors' own time. So there'll be online information to download, whether through video, briefings, slides, etc. And information that is mandatory. So sessions that are mandatory, we would encourage councillors to attend in person, and those are particularly around various different roles in various different committees. So whether it's a planning committee, sub-licensing committee, scrutiny, whether you're chairing a meeting, attending a meeting, participating as a ward member or as a different role within the meeting. So it covers a huge range of subjects. There are also optional sessions. So for example, a session on our own Lord Mayor and our civic party and what that means for the city and why that's different in this city than, for example, other cities. So very, very happy to take your feedback. You can see in section 10 the various different kind of considerations we went through when we were developing this programme, including the format, how the content can be provided in bite-sized chunks to make it easier for people to understand what's going on. And then also importantly, we're hoping to link with the council's own development platform called Milo, which gives members the opportunity to register that they've attended, so we've got an ongoing record. But also so that councillors know how far they've got in the programme itself, so it kind of provides a learning record for you. And then just as a sort of final point, we've scheduled a review session in December so that any elected member can drop in and have a conversation with us about whether they've learned sufficiently about that particular subject, whether they'd like to revisit anything, or whether they'd like to go into more detail about any subject that is included within the programme. So I'll stop there and take any comments. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Claire. I'm just guessing, Joe, that you might have something to say because you started.
It's a bit like after the Lord Mayor's show, where I think I was acting as my own Lord Mayor really, which is, I think being a councillor is difficult. I think being a new councillor is very difficult. I think this demonstrates how bleeding difficult it is because there is so much in here. And sometimes it'd be helpful if people actually realise how much has to be done. Equally, being a council officer and a senior council officer is very difficult. It reflects around some of this stuff as well. And, you know, I'm one of the few people around here who could say, lots of people around here work very hard to produce this kind of stuff from different perspectives. It's well done. It would frighten the something out of me if I had to work through a training program like that. But it's very important that those of you who are elected do. And it's very impressively written up in my view.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Councillor Fisher.
Thank you. I'll add to that in no uncertain terms. I mean, I wasn't technically a newly elected member in 2019 because I had served on this authority, but it was 20 years ago. And there are things like computers and accounts and, you know, which were totally new to me. I still haven't worked out how to do some of the things on my council computer because I didn't get trained. And, you know, being a councillor is hard work. But it's less hard work if you're fully trained at the start and actually know what you're doing, not running around like a headless chicken going to the wrong people. You know, some people probably say I still do that, but you know, it is so much easier if you've had a full training package and you understand the job early on, because for 4 years, you know, it's not funny just not knowing what's going on.
Thanks, Councillor Fisher. I have to say I was very impressed, and I think for me one of the really important bits is the pre-election session, so that people who are candidates can ask questions, they can understand a bit more, but crucially so that they can make sure their diaries are clear for those dates in case they do get elected. But I think it's a really comprehensive programme, and you know, there's quite a few of us who were elected for the first time in 2019 around this table, and Tony elected for the second time, but with a gap. But I think, you know, we went from having very, very little to looking at something like that makes you kind of hope for re-election, really. So I think it's really impressive. I think also I would be a real fan of having that record of learning on Milo, just for that transparency, but also for everyone's, you know, individual benefit. I think that would be a really positive step forward as well. Councillor Perrott.
Thanks, Chair. This is really, really positive. It's definitely much more than we had, which is lovely to see. I was going to ask about the availability of this and whether it could be made available to all candidates, because if it goes to newly elected members as part of PACs, it's potentially quite late to be arranging sort of leave from work and childcare and that sort of thing. So can it be made available as soon as possible, really, with as clear timings on when anything that is compulsory has to go in, just because it does take time, doesn't it, to arrange cover?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. I'll make sure it's got all the times in, because some of them haven't got the full times in, and I'll make sure that the dates that we haven't got, we will put in before we send it out. But there's not many left to arrange, actually. So yeah, as soon as that's finished, I'll get that out to everyone, and we can publish it on the website. So people who are considering being elected and considering coming to the session have that in advance as well, if that's all right with Bryn.
And perhaps just to supplement that, what we can do is put it on the election pages as well, so that there's obviously there are election pages of the council's website, so that if you're just looking there for forms, well, there's the list of training as well.
Anything else from anyone on this? Overwhelmingly positive feedback. Thank you so much for the work that's gone into that. I know it's been a while in the development, but really, really pleased to see it. Okay, we move on to item 9, monitor 2 key corporate risks. Helen, are you taking us through this?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yeah, so this is the second monitor for 22-23 on the council's key corporate risks. We've done a full refresh of the 12 corporate risks that you'll see at Annex A. So all the risks have been reviewed by the owner, which tends to be a member of the council's corporate management team. And I've included within my report at paragraphs 19 to 25 details where a specific update has been made. I've also included, following the update at Monitor 1, there was 3 follow-up actions that were requested by this committee. So I've added some information, and my apologies for the delay in getting that detail back to members of this committee, but I've included in paragraphs 13 onwards details of those follow-up actions. So I'm happy to take comments about those. They've been provided by the key corporate risk owners where necessary. And I'd also just like to draw members' attention to paragraph 25, where through the discussion and the update that the Director of Place has made, he suggested that for both key corporate risk 8, which is a local plan, and key corporate risk 12, which is major instance, we do more of a full review of those ahead of the next monitor. Following the fact that there's been some changes to both of those areas, so he feels it's useful to provide a full review. So if you're in agreement, I will perhaps we could invite the director to that meeting and do more of a focus session about those two risks. I think would be useful.
I think that
So
would be really
take any other
helpful.
comments about the report. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. Questions, comments? Councillor Fisher.
I read the comment on page 105.19 about in general a number of KCRs have been updated this year to remove reference to COVID-19 where the risks are no longer relevant. I would caution against writing COVID off completely. I think it's still going to affect the absence rate, because I know there are several officers I've had personal dealings with who've been off on long-term sick and still are not fully recovered. And I also do worry whether we've seen the end of it. I think it could be, you know, we're seeing what's happening in China now, where there's been another massive outburst. It just needs a variant to come through that, you know, is not easily dealt with by the vaccines. We could be right back in it. But I mean, at the moment, I'm happy that I think we're living with COVID. But I think we'd be cautious. I think cautious just to keep it under review.
Do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I take your point, and certainly I wouldn't say that we've removed all references. It's more where the risk has changed slightly, or the wording has probably been updated as well in some cases, just to change the references to COVID-19. But we've certainly got it still on the risk detail where needed.
Joe, did you?
It's corporate risk 2, KCR 2, in the discussion we just had about the thing which is part of it, which is about the training. I almost wonder if there's a corporate risk 2 and a corporate risk 13. In other words, every 4 years, the cycle of change throws up a set of very specific issues. Now you can call them governance, but they're actually, they're a slightly different group. It's about political corporate memory rather than, in some ways, as well as organizational corporate memory. So if you get a lot of change in senior politicians, you've actually lost a particular kind of corporate memory, and that may have implications down the track. And it may be happily covered off in the stuff that has been done on their training. You know, that's something you do once every 4 years, but it's cyclical. It's going to come through every 4 years. It's not an annual key one, whereas a lot of the other one is. So it's either a significant add-on every 4 years, or it's almost a subset of things. A bit of orbit addictor, a bit of comment on it, really, no more.
Thank you, Joe. Is there anything you want to come back on that, Helen? No.
No, thank you. I take your point. Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay, I'm going to jump in with my couple then. At paragraph 16 on page 104, you've given us, as part of the follow-up actions, the update about appointment of an access officer. So we're all delighted that we now have an access officer. And I suppose this actually links back a little bit to the previous item as well. And I wondered if in KCR 2 under governance, obviously there's comment made about we've completed the PIR action plan, but we are still doing that ongoing work about embedding good governance. And I think the appointment of the access officer is quite a key thing in there, because we can't do good governance unless we understand access, frankly, because that's been a particular bone of contention over the past couple of years. And I just wondered if that almost needed to be linked up a little bit. And following on from that, I think in KCR 2, the LGA peer review is mentioned as a control, but I almost wondered if we needed something in terms of any action we might take, because it isn't their review in itself which is going to have an effect, is it? It's anything we do as a result of it. So I wondered if we needed to just expand on that a little bit and say that, you know, recommendations will go to full council or something like that, just so that we make sure we're also covering what we're going to do about it. We could just sit and listen to it, and that would all be very nice. But we have to actually do something about it, don't we?
Thank you. Yeah, I think I can update that with if Bryn's in agreement.
Bryn?
I suppose on that point, as things stand, the control is simply that you will receive the report. What then comes out of that then becomes further controls that will be fed into the risks. So, you know, a report to council will then become another control on the risk. And then whatever action council takes becomes a further one, and it perpetuates itself through the risk register to demonstrate that we are continuing to evolve through it.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I think I'd prefer that we did have something in that control to say that that's being dealt with in time to be able to make recommendations to full council, because that's the action, isn't it? As I think Joe pointed out earlier, noting a report isn't very active. Anybody else? Any questions on that? I also just want to say thank you for doing the bit about the power outages. That was, the briefing note was helpful, because I know when we last met, it was kind of something new and quite scary, and it's good to see that it's been, you know, considered, and you've helped us to understand it.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else from anyone? Then with that, we have no urgent business. So our meeting is closed. Thank you very much, everyone, for contributions this evening. We've got through an awful lot.